Welcome to our Bible study. We are on week number 25. We're in Romans chapter 8. We're kind of getting to the peak of the book of Romans. If this is your first time with us, by all means, stick around. But after this, it's probably best to go back and check the other ones that came before this, because book of Romans is not meant to be zoomed in on individual pieces without making sure you see the rest of it, right? We talk every week about we don't want to miss the forest because we look too closely at the individual trees. On that note, there's three takeaways that really need to be on the front of our brains as we study chapter 8 of Romans. The first is just that what we just talked about. Don't miss the forest for the trees. Don't zoom in too close that you miss the bigger picture that Paul is painting, right? That today's section is actually part of a larger section that will end all the way in verse 30, but it started all the way back in chapter 7. And the section that we're looking at started with verse 17 of chapter 8. So it's kind of one of those, don't miss the thing that we're talking about for its purpose in the larger argument. The second thing, again, is to pay attention to the conjunction, right? That old schoolhouse rock, conjunction, junction, what's your function? Look for the connecting words. That helps us cue into Paul's larger argument here. And that's really, really important to today's section and all of chapter 8. And the last thing is to make sure that we maintain a first century Jewish perspective. That's who Paul is writing. That's what the perspective he's writing from. He's writing to a Gentile audience as well, but he's also writing through the lens of somebody who was raised with the expectation of the Messiah as part of the people of Israel. So that's going to come in pretty heavy today too towards the end. So last week, just to recap to make sure we're staying within this train of thought, Paul kind of wrapped up the whole problem of the law and sin and how law condemns us because we couldn't keep it. How Jesus set us free from that because he kept the law. He was the true Israelite, the true human, and he was the one who was able to actually keep the law and thus set us free from the penalty that we owe, right? We have a problem. That was chapter 7, the current state of things, that our sinfulness, our flesh, it's brought us to a point where we can't be saved through any of our own efforts or strengths. But Christ did the work for us, and now we're set free. There's no problem now for those who are part of Christ's family, who are saved by Jesus' death and resurrection for his people. There's no condemnation, right? And then because of that, and last week this is where we kind of wrapped up, was we no longer owe a debt to sin, right? We're not owing a debt as a slave owes to a master, right? We're not controlled by sin anymore. We don't owe that debt anymore. Christ paid that debt. But now we're as children who owe their parents, right? That we are heirs, right? A child who is going to inherit their parents' kingdom, their parents' wealth, or whatever, their parents' authority. Think princes and kings. Well, yes, that prince, that princess owes their parents a debt, but it's not the same kind of debt as a slave owes a master. It's somebody who owes love, right? They owe paying it forward, that they owe the way they live their life to the way they were raised, to the sacrifices that their parents made for them, the things they've done for them. We as children owe our parents who treated us like that, who raised us like that, a debt to live our lives the way they had hoped for us, basically. That we have a response to the way they raised us. That is the debt that we owe as heirs of Christ, as heirs of God with Christ, that we owe God that debt to live our lives accordingly. So last week we finished with verse 17, and it's also technically the beginning of today's thought section. So it says, and if we're children, we're also heirs, heirs of God and fellow heirs with the Messiah, as long as we suffer with him, so that we may also be glorified with him. Continuing on to verse 18, he said, this is how I work it out. The sufferings we go through in the present time are not worth putting in the scale alongside the glory that is going to be unveiled for us. Yes, creation itself is on tiptoe with expectation, eagerly awaiting the moment when God's children will be revealed. Creation, you see, was subjected to pointless futility, not of its own volition, but because of the one who placed it in this subjection, in the hope that creation itself will be freed from its slavery to decay, to enjoy the freedom that comes when God's children are glorified. Now, this section of chapter 8 is one it's pretty widely misunderstood, right? And we owe that to really two main culprits. And the first is the King James translation, and the other is to medieval and Reformation Platonist theologians, right? We owe it to these two groups, things. And again, I'm not saying that it was necessarily their fault, but it is because of their contributions that this passage gets misunderstood, because this passage, the way the authorized version, the King James Version, translates it, and it communicates an idea that theologians in the Middle Ages and Reformation ran with, that's actually not there in the original argument. Let me just read the authorized version. It says, and we'll just do verse 19 through 21. It says, "For the earnest expectation of the creature waiteth for the manifestation of the sons of God. For the creature was made subject to vanity, not willingly, but by reason of him who hath subjected the same in hope. Because the creature itself also shall be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God." Now, I'm not a King James Version hater. In college, we did translations from the original Greek text, and we compared it to most translations of the popular ones, including the King James. And the King James was really well done for its time and age, right? Like, a lot of the words that it uses don't mean the same thing anymore. Creature and vanity, those aren't accurate for today's age. We don't use those words the same way. The word there, creature, is katesis. It's kind of like, comes from the word knitzo, which, knit, like God knit together, they're creating. It kind of has the same root there. Creature, we think of a small woodland animal, not creation as a whole. And then you take vanity, and vanities, we use that word to mean self-obsession, right? Somebody who's just focused on vain things, on shallow things, how they look, how they appear, right? How popular they are, right? It paints this picture when we read it from a modern view that it's worried about a bunch of like little rabbits like being self-obsessed, like obviously that's not what it means. That's not what they meant originally when they translated it. But this normal reading, even if you did understood creature and vanity in that original 1600s concept, or context rather, you'd still come to a conclusion that this section is about escaping a broken, evil world, right? That this section is about going to heaven when we die and escaping this brokenness. That's Plato. That is Plato's idea, which is secular entirely. It predates Christ by a long time. But it's that idea, and it was really popular in the Middle Ages, and it was popular in the Reformation, that this world, you look around, it's evil, it's broken. We need to escape it. God's going to save us and take us to a better place, right? That's this Platonic idea. In order to understand what Paul really meant here and get back to what the actual meaning of this section is and how it has meaning, instead of just skipping it over and go to the next part, which is a part a lot of people focus on, they kind of breeze over this assuming they know what it means, we need to look at a word here. And it's a word that's used over and over. It's the word glory. You read in verse 17 of chapter 8, it says, "As long as we suffer with Christ, so that we may also be glorified with him." Right? This is the beginning of a thought section, and it's the glory is a big part of it. And it says here that we are going to be glorified with Christ, right? And then we look at verse 21, and it says that creation itself would be freed from slavery to decay to enjoy the freedom that comes when God's children are glorified. So here we're seeing that creation is excited for Christians to be glorified with Christ. And then you jump down to where this whole thought section ends, which isn't part of today's section, verse 30. It says, "And he marked those out in advance. He also called. Those he called, he also justified. And those he justified, he also glorified." God glorifies those he justified. And this all is going to work together to show that this is what God's creation plan is. If you want to here's the point, it's going to go back to the way things were at the beginning. We have the 3 P's. God's people, living in the place he made them, in his presence. That's the 3 P's of creation. That's how it started. That's where it's going to end. That's the design for creation. God wanted people, so he made people. He wanted a place for them to live, so he made creation. And he wanted to be in their presence. We lost all of that when at Adam and Eve, right? And then we're working towards that again. When Christ returns, that comes back. That's the point here. But it's a little bit more nuanced than that, because it's not about escaping the creation. It's about redeeming and renewing the creation. And what does that have to do with glory, right? A lot of times when we think of glory, we think of a proud moment maybe, or something that's really admirable. The word here is the word doxa, and it comes from dokeo. And dokeo is kind of related to thinking or weighing something, like figuring out something's value. You know, it's expressing personal opinion, which determines value. You know, if you're going to look at the glory of something, you're going to look at how much it's worth. And so it's not so much that glory is a good thing here. It's what is the person or the thing's worth is kind of the word it comes from. But in this context, it's more related to the Hebrew word kabo, which means to be heavy, right? And it essentially, it implies an intrinsic value or a worth, its substance, its essence. And so within Romans 8, we can really simplify and nail this down. To glory means God's presence and humanity's rule over creation. That's basically what it boils down to. That's the way Paul's using doxa, glory, here in Romans 8. The presence of God himself dwelling within us in his spirit, that is the glory of God dwelling within us, and the wise, healing, reconciling rule of God's people over all of creation. That is what he means by glory here. Let me explain how we know that's what he means. These two ideas, they go together. You can't have the second one without the first one. You can't have the humanity's healing, renewing rule over creation without God's divine presence dwelling within us, right? Again, 3 P's: God's people, God's place, God's presence. All right? And so in order to figure this out, we got to go back to what we talked about earlier with that conjunction junction. What's your function? Those connecting words, gar, right? Like a pirate. And so we see in verse 17, it says, we suffer with him so that we may also be glorified with him. Okay. For, verse 18, gar, the present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be unveiled for us. Verse 19, for gar, creation is on tiptoe waiting for God's children to be revealed. Verse 24, gar, creation was subject to fulfillity, skip a little bit, in the hope that, haughty, another connecting word, creation itself would be freed from slavery to enjoy the freedom that comes when God's children are glorified. Now, with the normal understanding of this passage that God is going to glorify us by taking us to heaven, right? That's our glory. We go to the good place, right? We escape the bad place. How does verse 19 explain verse 18, right? If verse 18 is saying we're suffering and that the present sufferings, they don't compare to the end, why does it say that because of that, creation is on its tiptoe, right? It doesn't make sense with the Greek. Like a lot of translations kind of ignore this and they translate it so you're not forced to connect those two verses, but they're connected. Because the present sufferings don't compare to our future glory, creation's on its tiptoe waiting for us to be glorified. Why does creation care if it's going to be like done away with, right? If we're going to leave it behind, why does it care? It doesn't make sense. And as Michael Heiser always said, your Bible should make sense. See, the principle that God's people will rule over creation is all over the Bible. You go all the way back to Genesis 1, that we are created with the divine image. That is our authority to rule over God's creation, right? And then Genesis 2, he tells us to go, be fruitful, multiply, cultivate the earth, take care of it, garden it, tend it. That's Genesis 2. But these two things were lost through sin's corruption. We lost our authority as true humanity. We were corrupted. We were not as we were supposed to be. And therefore we lost our vocation, our ability to fully live that out. We don't have the authority. We don't have our job anymore. But then you go to Psalm 8 and we see that this is restored through that authority and that vocation being given to the true human, to the Son of God, as it says in Psalm chapter 8. It's given to the true human and then to the rest of the true humans in Psalm chapter 8. That the vocation and the authority is restored through him. And that sentiment is echoed in Psalm chapter 2, Daniel 7, Psalm 110. And then Paul reiterates those same sentiments in 1 Corinthians 15 and Philippians 3. We see that there is this connection between our authority as divine image bearers and our vocation as stewards of the garden that creation wants back. Now, if you were to jump to that first century world again, and getting to our third thing that we always pay attention to when we're studying Paul, and we think through the lens of a first century Jewish worldview, and we ask somebody with that worldview this question: what is the hope of glory? We ask them that question. What is the hope of glory? They would give you one of, if not two, answers. They would say, we are hoping that our God will return in power and majesty to dwell in the temple and establish the kingdom over Israel and all the world, right? They are expecting God to return. They want God to restore Israel to its glory, to its true value, right? As a people, as a nation, they want God's presence back. They want the land back. They want to be, they still are God's people, right? Like they were expecting God to restore the land and his presence. That's one big answer. They want God's glory, his value to return to them. And we see that represented in Isaiah 40 and Isaiah 52. They would also probably say the hope of glory is that God's people will be set in authority under him and over the world, right? This is a massive part of the first century Jewish worldview, that God would restore through his Messiah the people of Israel, their land, his presence, but also set them on top of everybody. They expected a physical resurrection, and they expected that God would subjugate the whole world underneath Israel, underneath his people. And this is the normal reading of Daniel chapter 7 and Psalm 8 for that first century worldview. This was humanity's glory, Israel's glory. You have the return of the divine glory, and you have the revealing of humanity's glory. You have this expectation built in that Paul would have been raised with, but now Jesus has shown up and revealed the truth. And the expectations are still there, but they're just transformed into something much better, because we see that God's plan all along has been for us to rule over creation as co-heirs with Christ. We will be glorified with Christ, given the value with Christ as Christ was valued, right? We are glorified with Christ, and we are his co-heirs, inheriting the same kingdom he inherits, all of creation, which is getting creation back to that initial design, right? I mean, this is why verse 18 says that whatever suffering we face now, it won't hold a candle to what's to come, because we are going to rule all of creation with Christ. And this is why creation is on tiptoe waiting for us to be revealed and glorified in verse 19 and 21. Think about it like this. If we were to break down the universe existence into its biggest parts, we would have three pieces, right? You would have God, the creator, the designer, and the power source of all of creation. That is who he is. You have creation, the thing itself, and then you would have humanity, the stewards of that creation, the beings tasked with maintaining, improving, taking care of, running that creation. If you want to use an analogy, think of it like domestic sheep, right? A domestic sheep is helpless without a farmer. Because if their wool is not sheared every so often, they'll eventually die because they won't be able to move. They'll be in pain, they'll be miserable until they can't eat and starve to death, or they get attacked by a predator, right? A domestic sheep is useless without a farmer. A domestic dairy cow is useless without a farmer. If it's constantly needing milk and it doesn't get milk, it could die, from what I understand. That eventually the milk section will just, the udder will get infected, or it'll burst, or things like that. Like that a dairy cow needs a farmer to milk it. That it is in pain and miserable without the farmer, right? Cars, if you do not maintain them, if you do not change the oil and the fluids, and if you do not put gas in it, it's going to break and it's not going to run right. A car was designed by an engineer, but it was designed with us to maintain it. If you don't maintain it, it's not going to work properly. Gardens, if you do not maintain them, they will go fallow. They will not produce what they are supposed to produce. They may produce some things, probably a lot of weeds, maybe a flower or two, but they're not going to produce what you want them to produce. That is the way creation works. It was designed with the human element in mind. We are supposed to be here. We're not supposed to just step back and let it be itself. No, like we were designed to maintain, to improve. Creation is never going to be what it is supposed to be until humanity is finally and fully revealed and set back in its proper place amongst creation. Creation was designed with us in mind. And we can't fully live that role out as the gardeners, as the stewards of creation, until we are justified, authorized, and glorified with Jesus. This is why Platonism, this idea that we are escaping a broken physical world, and Christianity do not work together. We don't escape creation when creation was designed for us and with us in mind. We're destined to be the fix of this place, not the escape of it. Colossians 3:4, it says it like this: when the Messiah, when Jesus is revealed, and he is your life, remember, then you too will be revealed with him in glory. Creation is waiting on Christ's people to be revealed so it can stop suffering. Right? That's what Paul is trying to get at here in this first part of our study on this section of Romans. We're going to finish it with the second half of this little section, verse 22 through 30 next week. But this idea that creation needs us, but we're not there. We're not present. We're not fulfilling the role that it needs us to fulfill, and therefore it is broken. We are breaking creation through our sinfulness. That is what that whole idea means. When we say that natural disasters only exist because sin exists, this is what Paul was talking about. That the world is broken, not because the world is sinful, but it has been corrupted because sin has done to it, sin has been done around it, and sin has been done on it. And sin has a physically corrupting effect. Most notably in this case, humanity is not gardening the way we're supposed to. We're not maintaining the way we're supposed to. We're not interacting with creation the way that we're supposed to. This isn't a call to step back and let nature heal itself. This is a call to Christ, because only when we are justified, when we are authorized, and we are glorified in Christ do we have a chance of finally treating creation the way it's supposed to. And so we can summarize today's section with verse like this. We can say in verses 17 and 18, the final new creation, with us playing our glorious part, will be so spectacular that no present suffering can weigh against it. And then verses 19 through 21, all of that is because the presently frustrated creation will be released from its slavery to decay when God's children are given their glorious sovereign stewardship, when we finally be what we are designed to be. So what does that mean for us now? If you read the Great Commission, it starts out with Jesus saying, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Then he looks at his disciples and says, now go. Baptize them, teach them, show them. He says, I have the authority. I have the kingdom now, right? You have the Spirit dwelling within you. God's glory has been within you. You are a new creation, and now you have the authority to go and spread the kingdom. Make this authority, make this kingdom a bigger reality in the hearts of the people you encounter. We are made new. That's God's presence. We are given the task of sharing this message, this kingdom, Christ's authority, with the world around us. We're not supposed to just sit here and wait to escape a broken creation. We're supposed to start the work now. This is the glorious now, but not yet. That there will be a moment when we are revealed in Christ. Not that we're transformed into Christ, that when we are revealed, because we're supposed to be already participating in this renewing work in the here and now. Hopefully this helps this section of Romans have new meaning, have new weight in your life, and helps you understand the way that God is interacting with the world around you. If you have any questions, reach out. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.